Hey guys, and welcome to the first video on our chapter on classical Rome. And for this video, we'll be talking about the earliest foundations of Roman society and its evolution eventually into a republic. So, early origins. Tradition, and much of it is legend, kind of traces Roman heritage all the way back to Greek heritage through Aeneas. Aeneas was this guy here. You see him carrying his crippled father and escaping with his children through the burning city of Troy. They were the only members of the Trojan royal family who escaped the destruction when the Greeks got in. You know, they were able to sneak in through the Trojan horse and, you know, that whole legend in the Iliad. But Aeneas, according to Roman legends, was able to escape with the help of his mother, Aphrodite, or Venus in Roman religion, the goddess of love and beauty. And he journeyed around in a series of adventures and eventually settled on the Italian peninsula, and his descendants would eventually go on to become the Romans. So a way of kind of connecting ancient Greek heritage up through Roman times. And a couple of his descendants, and again, you know, the kind of a mixing of history and legend, were these two here, Romulus and Remus. You see, they are closely associated with the wolf. According to legend, Romulus and Remus, they were abandoned as infants. You know, they did not know of their royal heritage, tracing back through Aeneas, and that they were saved by a she-wolf who, you know, gave them life. Again, you know, I mean, you take that for what it's worth. Most historians do not accept that as being fact, but it is widely accepted that a man by the name of Romulus did found what would eventually be the city of Rome in 753 BCE. So, you know, a lot of overlap that you find in a number of cultures with history and legend and the origins. But what is known is that in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, a group of people right in the middle of the Italian peninsula built a city, and this would eventually become Rome. Now you look on the map here, this small area, okay, you got to look at the color coding. Now you see purple, the early Romans. This right here, okay, the earliest foundations of Rome. Now the other colors, Latium, the people of Latium, they would really be the heavy influence on it. That's where Latin, the eventual language of the Romans, would come from. So the Romans identified themselves as being a Latin people. Now to the south, you've got Greeks. Those Greek colonies, right? We talked about those last chapter, how they settled around the bottom of the peninsula in Sicily. They would have a very, very heavy impact on early Roman culture. And up here, you've got these people called the Etruscans. Now, the Etruscans were not Latin. They were an Indo-European people, you know, and they came down, and they dominated Italy between the 8th and 5th centuries BCE. You know, in fact, they dominated Rome. So these, you know, a lot of this, again, is lost to legend, the so-called 7 kings of Rome and so forth. But you did have Etruscan rulers of Rome during this time. And you see some of their cultural influence as well. Togas. All right, you see this from a very, very old Etruscan fresco painting, you know, with the use of togas and gladiator games. You know, so elements of Etruscan heritage carried over for hundreds of years into later Roman times. All right, so that brings us to the Roman Republic. Now, you see the symbol of the Roman Republic, SPQR. That stands for Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Roman Senate and people. You know, and republic was a fairly new concept of government during those times. You know, the majority of them were monarchies. But when they overthrew the last Etruscan king in 509 BCE, the Romans had a very healthy mistrust of monarchies. They didn't want it. But at the same time, they were not completely ready to turn this into a democracy like in Athens. They didn't want to give control to the common people. So they created what became known as an aristocratic republic, where it was a representative government, but power was still largely in the hands of the rich. Now, the officials who ran the government were 2 consuls. Okay, you have the consuls here. And there were always 2 of them, you know, kind of like an early system of checks and balances. And they were the executives. If the president is the chief executive of our federal government, these guys were the same. They were in charge of running the government and the military. You see the fasces, the symbol behind them there. That'll become the symbol of the Italian fascist party in the 1930s and 40s. And they were chosen every other year, and they were chosen by the aristocrats, by the rich. And the organization that a lot of people felt was the true power behind it was the Senate. Okay, so you got the Senate here, And originally, at least, they were all members of the upper class. Okay, so you had to be rich in order to be in the Senate, and they had an awful lot of power in that they weren't necessarily the lawmaking powers body the way that the Senate is in our own government. They had to approve all major decisions. So, and they also had to approve the consuls. So it gave them an awful lot of power and influence. Plus, you were chosen for life once you were a senator. So pretty sweet gig. Now, as you can see, the rich definitely had an upper hand, and this is going to create a lot of class tension between the two major groups. You've got the patricians, these are your rich, and the plebeians, and these are your commoners, your plebs. The patricians, for being rich, they had control of the upper levels, but the plebeians said that eventually we need to have some power in this as well. And reforms were made in order to give the plebeians some representation in the government, and this would result in the tribunes. Tribunes represented plebeians, and they could also veto major decisions. Again, example of checks and balances. Eventually, by the 3rd century, the plebs really started to gain more control of the government, 3rd century BCE, and they could even kind of appoint their own senators. So it did give a little bit of evening out and a little bit more of a truly democratic feel to it. Now, dictators existed in the Roman Republic as well. Dictators were not necessarily, evil, megalomaniacal, maniacs who would take over and just rule ruthlessly. During times of crisis, the Roman Senate would voluntarily hand power over to a single ruler, usually an ex-military guy. And then it was thought that it to be more efficient. So rather than having a large group, you just have one person making all the decisions. And then once the crisis was over, that person would then step down. Famous example of this being Cincinnatus, who was, a former retired general and was living as a farmer. And they went to him and asked him to lead the Romans to victory while the enemies were at the gate. He led them to victory and then very humbly and quietly gave up the dictatorship and went back to the farm. And that really kind of set the standard for dictatorships throughout. Something to keep in mind later on when we talk about Caesar. Okay, expansion. The Romans expanded very quickly, starting around the 5th century BCE. You see in the dark red area here around Rome, that was about 500 BCE or so. And then by 338, they had really started to work their way down and conquered around those former Latin areas. And then by 264, this one here, okay, by the start of the First Punic War, you can see how they pretty much got the entire Italian peninsula under their control. The islands around would eventually come under their control, and even up around here, what would be along the border of modern-day Austria through the Alps and so forth would eventually as well. But, within a couple of hundred years, they expanded very quickly and consolidated their control. And they were able to do this largely because of their military buildup. They were able to, they established a warrior culture, and they had very strict discipline for it. And also, they weren't looked at as being tyrannical. They had a relatively tolerant rule. They were generous in their policies towards the conquered people. The conquered people did have to provide them with military support, and they could only do business with Rome. But other than that, they were allowed to use their local officials. They could keep their own language and religion. It's very similar to the rule of the Persians. The Punic Wars. The Punic Wars were the wars that really established Rome as being the dominant power in the Mediterranean. And this was between Rome and Carthage. Okay, you see the purple here, the Carthaginian Empire. Carthage was hundreds of years prior to this, was a Phoenician trade outpost. Remember the Phoenicians, they were, early people from what today would be Israel and Lebanon, and they established trade outposts all throughout the Mediterranean. And Carthage eventually used that trade empire to establish an actual military empire. Now, Rome, by this point, the Roman Republican allies they were jockeying for position of top dog in the Mediterranean, and they figured, well, we got to knock off Carthage. And in a series of 3 wars, Rome won and was victorious, and very decidedly. And by the end of the 3rd one, they went to Carthage, and the Romans destroyed the city, destroyed the crops, and sold any remaining Carthaginians into slavery. So it was a very, very decisive victory for the Romans. To the east of this, so this would be a little bit off of this map, they started to form rivalries with those Hellenistic empires, particularly the Antigonid Empire here. Actually, you know what? Let me get rid of all this first so that other circle doesn't get in the way. All right, the Antigonid dynasty and then the Seleucid dynasty through here. Remember, those were those dynasties taken over by two of Alexander the Great's generals. And the Antigonid took over their homeland of Macedonia, and the Seleucid inherited really the bulk of the old Persian Empire. Well, there started to be more rivalry. They did maintain trade relations with them at first, but eventually realized, okay, Greece, Asia, these are going to be areas that we're going to need to expand into. The other major Hellenistic empires, particularly the Ptolemaic one down here in Egypt, they pretty much just maintained strong trade relations with them at first and figured that conquests could possibly come later, which it will. All right, so that's it for the Republic and the early foundations. And the next video, we will get into talking about moving from Republic into a Roman Empire.